And he said, it's a sacrifice. And I said, I wasn't willing to make that sacrifice though. I said, if you were to go home and look at your family, who would you like to sacrifice?
There's a change in your quality of life when you're gambling on it, and not only for personally yourself on it, but more so with your parents and your family on it. And
incredibly effective in having legislators commiserate with me and pity me and show sympathy, and after testimonies tell me how brave I am. And I've since come to find that quite patronizing and unwelcome, because then they don't do anything with that information.
When we campaigned against fixed loss betting terminals, we called them the crack cocaine of gambling.
What we see from these is a line by line, moment by moment, written record of the gambling that led to somebody's death.
You have to say the same thing again and again and again, and it just goes on forever.
The purpose of this is really how do we activate citizens, with people who've been harmed by this, either have loved ones who've been harmed or they themselves have been harmed, to demand gambling reform. That's the kind of the big arching question.
Thank you, Les, for that. And I just want to say, if I could have a redo for our introductions last night, I should have said too, this SPG group has been such an incredible part of my story for almost all of my 28 years. So going way back, and I'm just honored to be in the room with all of you who continue this fight as well. So gotta start there. So my story is with my brother. I start my speaking every time by saying, I'm here to speak today because my brother is not. Had he still been here today, he definitely would have been in this fight with me. He understood more than we knew about the addiction, talking about hearing the stories over here from the Ritchie family and hearing how you go in and you look for other, the notes and the things that just to try to figure out what was going on in the mind of my brother or of their son. I can't do it. It's not me. I wasn't the gambler, so it was hard for me to understand. So the only way I knew to understand it was to reach out and to go to people and to talk about it. And so I started by calling the Gamblers Anonymous groups and said, can I just sit in? I just need to hear what's going on. So I started there, and then I met up with Tom Gray and realizing that this was an issue that was bigger than anything I understood. And so connecting, and by doing that, I had to go where people were. So I started out by going to the state office and finding out what they knew, going to different meetings, not just Gamblers Anonymous, but other meetings around town, and speaking at churches and just on the street corner at our Saturday markets, just talking to people and saying, what do you know? What do you know about gambling? And how can we change this perspective of what it is right now? And so I think for me, that was the most important part, is I just needed to understand for myself what was going on with my brother. I didn't understand the addiction. I didn't understand, I think you said it yesterday, how a machine could be addictive. I'm like, it's a machine and you're pushing a button. How can that be addictive? And learning then through all the different revenues how they're designed for that. There's people who go and design them that way. They look into it and they go, well, there's certain smells or sounds or colors that attract certain people. And so different machines are set up to attract different people. For the Asian community, that was one of the things we noted, that they were different machines and different sounds and things than they were in our community. So just looking around, I mean, it's so interesting when you start asking. When we first started, so my brother Bobby passed in July 20th of 1995. His birthday was in September, and so I had this bright idea that we need Problem Gamblers Awareness Day. There's an awareness day for everything out there. And we were laughed at, we were mocked, we were told this was ridiculous, we were told that we should be ashamed, that we shouldn't even be saying the words gambling and suicide in the same sentence because it makes gambling look bad and we shouldn't be doing that in our community. We got one reporter who came to our very first problem gambling. We couldn't get, went around town and just asked for people to donate a space, like a parking lot space, where we could just set up and talk to people as they were coming in and out through the malls or through the downtown area, and we were told no, that we couldn't do it. So we did it at my sister's house, and we did get one reporter who came, and he said, I'm just curious. I don't understand what you guys are doing. I don't understand the problem gambling, like problem gambling. Why are those two words together? It's entertainment. It's things that people do. And it's been around forever, and you're not going to change that. So I'm just curious what you're doing here. And so we told our story, and we just continued to knock on doors and continued to tell our story wherever we could get it. One of the big meetings we were at, I had someone say, we all bring something different to the table, because we don't have money. We're not from we're ordinary people, right? We are those ordinary people who didn't know what else we had going for us, except that we had this knowledge now that we felt we needed to share with other people. If we were unaware, there were other people who were unaware. And so, but they said, I have money, I can put money on the table. And someone else said, well, I know some political avenues that we could take maybe. And someone else said, well, we have a print shop or a business, and we can do some printing for you if you need printing. And so just having all of those different people involved in the fight made it possible for me to be here 28 years later. I am not funded. I am blessed by people who have helped me get to where I'm at through, helping me get to conferences so that I can learn and understand more. People who have offered their services of print shop things, people who have helped me just gain knowledge by listening, whether that be the people who are gambling themselves or their family members. It takes a village. It takes everyone. And so, that's where I'm from, and I feel just very blessed to be able to do this and to be surrounded by people who helped.
How do you activate people who've been hurt by this? Hundreds and hundreds of people that you have helped and work with. What advice would you have to activate these folks to get involved in the process to demand reform in this country?
Yeah, I'm not even sure if I belong on this panel on it. I do it on a grassroots basis. I've been in Gamblers Anonymous for 26 years. And I've helped people throughout the world. I've been over to India and Budapest and Australia, all over the UK, and I speak about it. But I speak about it in front of Gamblers Anonymous. I go to their conventions and I talk on their levels on it. So I've been involved in the past. Right? Once you're addicted, and how do I talk about it? In my world, when I first came in, it was all about bookmakers and how to deal with bookmakers. So I've learned all that. And when at one point, I was gambling tens of thousands of dollars a night in my gambling on that. But recently, when I got in touch with the board, it was because of Nick that I talk about. And came in at 18 years old, and he had a problem with the gambling on it. I related myself to him because that's when I got addicted on it. So what happened to me is I had to find out what's new in this online gambling situation. It's a whole different world than me. I was gambling at the 1 o'clock bets, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock bets, and that was it. Game over, door closed, office closed on it. On the online gambling, what I had to find out was A, how do you do it? And B, how do you get hooked up to it? And then C, how do you help that person on it? It's a whole different area of learning on it. And that's when I had called up Les and said, where do we go with this? And what I've learned on it is I am truly an addict. when the youth comes in and they're young about it is where are they at? Are they addicted, or do they have a problem gambling, or is it a mixture of it? All right, and the education that I got from them came back and said the quality of life that they're dealing with is being lost. And that's the message that I bring out to everybody right now is you're changing your quality of life when you're gambling on it. And not only for a person or yourself on it, but more so with your parents and your family on it. And that's the education that I bring out to the overall, is get the parents involved in this. And some of the parents, what they do now is educate the other parents that's in their community, because this gambling situation is all over the place. I'm mentoring one youth right now. He's 17 years old, junior in high school, spending thousands of dollars a night. All right, where he's getting the money, I have no idea. But his father brought him in and had a problem. 4 months before that, his father brought his older brother in that was going to college up in Syracuse and brought the kid in. And he had a problem. He was betting a lot more than his brother. Right. Talking to the father about that, the first game around, gave him the eye-opening of what's going on in the community on it. That 17-year-old, when I talked to him, he brought in another member on it, and what they said during the basketball team, that 5 other kids on the basketball team should be put into our rooms as well. So it's growing to such an event on it. So I'm doing it almost on a one-to-one basis to spread it, but what's happening is they're spreading it through their high schools and then through their friends on it, and that's how it's gaining from that point. All right. And the other way I'm doing it is being involved with this organization here and getting the word out to many media possibilities that we do. Les and I work together on the lot we've done, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and a lot of other venues that we've done to spread the word on it. So I make myself available 24/7 to that. But the true dedication comes to when I see this youth coming into play and the disasters that's coming from it. When Matt was talking about it before, about responsible gaming and gambling on it, that's such a lie that goes on with it. When you're an addict, this word responsible is nowhere to be said in your language when you're an addict on it. And how they play that is so easy on the young mind to twist the story around it. And I just try to figure it all out. And that's part of why I'm here and part of why I love everybody's story on it and what they're doing with it. It's giving me, feeding my compulsive brain that I can start doing and taking it and figuring out even more stuff on it. It's a killer disease. And what I'll leave it at this. What I'm so afraid of is the youth that's addicted, that's 17, 18, or 21 years old, the youth that's affected now on it, they're realizing they got a problem on it. But that Z generation is being lost. All right? And it's almost not lost, it's being stolen from them. My fear is the next generation that's 14, 15 on it, and how to prevent that. Right. That is truly my goal, and should figure that out. This generation, they're figuring it out. There's going to be casualties along the way, but the true innocent kids, 12, 14, 13, that's my goal, to try to figure out how do you get that message to them.
Thank you, Gary.
Hi everyone, I'm Katie Martz from Portland, Oregon, and I think my answer is, I hadn't thought of it until now, so bear with me, but that the way I started doing advocacy work was very formulaic of what it was like, what happened, what it's like now, or talking about the pain to humanize the disordered gambling experience. And it was incredibly effective in having legislators commiserate with me and pity me and show sympathy, and after testimonies tell me how brave I am. And I've since come to find that quite patronizing and unwelcome, because then they don't do anything with that information. And so I've grown as an advocate that I no longer take that approach of how much suffering I experienced. And I so respect what John Kreutz said, that instead of identifying as problem gamblers, perhaps we should switch that narrative to something more along the lines of being a survivor of gambling operator exploitation, and rename ourselves and revisit our whole vernacular of are we responsible, do we have a disease, using person first and roles. And so I identify as not even just an advocate, but an activist. And part of gambling recovery is that you make a list of why you had gambling in your life and what needs it met, and they were good reasons that we were suffering. I had trauma and an emptiness, and just ways that it met my need to feel something. And we don't get a quality of life until we replace those things. And I found that I could replace those things in some ways by getting a bill sponsor and driving an hour to the state capitol 7 times to have my hearing rescheduled, and then the 8th time get some inside knowledge of what was going to happen, and then actually get it moved to committee. That little move on the scale does it for me. That gives my life meaning, and feels that it wasn't all in vain, and that I am meeting my obligation of having been spared to contribute to reducing the future suffering from gambling harm of other people. And because I work in the field that by definition I need to have lived experience, I'm not at risk of being a bank president in a small rural town that if people found out my gambling secret, I could lose the respect of my community. I feel an onus, a responsibility, that's a catchword today, isn't it? To speak these truths of that this did happen, and it was bad, and it wasn't our fault, and it is beholden on the operators and the regulators. Finally I'll say, I first met this nonprofit, Stop Predatory Gambling. I think it was in 2011. I was in a film by the producers of some Discovery Channel sensationalistic hoarders. And it was on state lotteries and publicly operated gambling. And I remember seeing Les talk about that we need to get away from this freebie of something for nothing, and not to have that same kind of way of thinking of gamblers want something for nothing. No, everyone enjoys, not to conserve energy. We're wired that way. But he says we need to get back to this, like hard work. And I enjoy the hard work, right? Not just luck. But I like putting the sweat equity into doing this work because it gives me a purpose and it gives me people to connect with. And I really need that. We're not going to be able to arbitrate this. I think of class action lawsuits all day long that I would love to bring against my state lottery or operators. I don't think we're going to have like federal regulation at some point. I'm fascinated by what y'all are doing in the UK that you do. The answer is, and I've learned this from Stop Predatory Gambling, is we have got to get folks together that have had this experience and give them agency to be able to just continually say, this happened, it's not our fault, it needs fixed, here's how you fix it, and just continually bang that drum.
Good job.
So I think a lot of my contribution today has been quite downbeat, so I would like to be a bit more positive in this panel. And I'd just say that from a lived experience perspective, I was gambling age 16 to age 20, went to a lot of debt, and when I recovered, I know what it's like to recover from an addiction. I was very lucky to have done so. I know that not many people don't, or worse. Let me say that I was super motivated and had loads of time on my hands because I wasn't gambling anymore. And I think people in that state are dangerous in a good way. I had nothing to lose. I literally had nothing to lose. And I didn't even have a job, and I appeared on a documentary talking about my addiction, and that's what led to me campaigning for a job. And I've met so many people like that in recovery who they hit a kind of inflection point when they stop gambling, and suddenly they turn into activists, and suddenly they turn into extremely passionate, driven people. I mean, they were always that person, but gambling got a hold of them, and then they become maybe even more passionate and dedicated and driven than they were before. Mobilising those people is so important, but in order to do that, the story that they're told about their addiction has to be the objective truth. It cannot be the industry narrative that it's all their fault, there's something wrong with them. I think the commercial determinants of harm has to feature in recovery and post-recovery. And if there's the mechanism to educate people about why they've become addicted, that will motivate them to be involved, to be activists, to speak up. And yes, the media is really interested in people's stories, and we don't want that to be exploited, of course not. But the truth is, the people that I've met in recovery can very easily become activist case studies. And I was one. I was going on TV and radio talking about my addiction to fixed odds betting terminals, and then I would pivot and talk about the wider policy issues and say this is why the government needs to do this. James Grimes, who runs the Big Step campaign for Gambling with Lives, is the same. He will get invited on to talk about his addiction to gambling and then pivot and give a fantastic argument why we need to ban gambling adverts. And the same with Gambling with Lives. Liz and Charles have obviously made the tough stuff, and you know they've told the story again and again, and I don't know how they do it personally. I think it's phenomenal. The way that, I mean, every time Charles and Liz speak about it, I am almost moved to tears. I don't know how they, and I've heard it many times, so I don't know how they do it, but they are still able to do it again and again and talk about all of the wider policy issues in its own right. So leveraging that, leveraging the kind of what the media wants to make a story, to make the news item work, to then into a form of activism. So it's not just a case study that's lost into the ether, it's something that can be attached to something else, to a wider movement, to an ask of a politician. That's the key. That's what we bring. It's not just lived experience and case studies, it's the pivot to the wider agenda.
Well said.
I would agree with that, but thank you for what you said. But I would say, in terms of the help for bereaved families, start with offering people help. In the UK, there is no help for bereaved families, nothing, apart from us in Gambling with Lives. And you need to start with saying, what do you need? What practical help do you need? And then there is a sort of enabling admission to a community. And Charles has just written down a list of people who have moved from only being able to cry at the first meeting to speaking out within a very short space of time. And actually, while we've been away and the white paper's been released, we've actually seen how many different people have been on different reports, haven't they?
Yeah.
Different bereaved families. I mean, it's half a dozen at least.
Yeah, it's phenomenal.
All speaking from their experience, but as Matt says, pivoting to the general policy. So one of the things that helps people even though it's very, very hard, is to understand what was done to the person that they love. And one of the things that we do is go through the subject access requests. Sometimes for the inquest, but sometimes people want to find out.
You say,
Yeah.
what is a subject access
Okay.
request?
Anybody else explain?
I
just want, there's something that was an
So-
equivalent here in
I'm
the US.
surprised if you don't have it here because it's about data, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know if there's a US equivalent, but essentially you can request from a private company or a charity or any entity that might hold data on you, personal data, you can request that from them. And there may be similar such provisions in US law where that can be requested. If there is, then it's a very good idea to start applying that to gambling companies.
We're a little more like, I think you guys have better regulations on those things. I'm making a note
It's
to
about
investigate
data
it. Yeah, but I'll find out. I don't think we're quite, yeah. I don't think we're that bad.
But they do try to not give it to you because it doesn't necessarily apply to somebody who's died. But for those of you who are recovering gamblers, actually, if they're British companies,
You have to be UK resident.
Do you?
Yeah.
Oh, right. Anyway, what we see from these is a line by line, moment by moment, written record of the gambling that led to somebody's death. Literally second by second, and whatever interventions happened. So it's rare that you see this. And when people see that, if they want to see it, many people don't want to see it, then obviously that galvanises them. And it galvanises people's anger. So if you can support people through the trauma and through the practical process of what's needed, then the anger can come through and is very facilitating. And that search for justice, it's not just campaigning to save other people, it's a search for justice for the person who's done. It's speaking on their behalf. And the principle of justice is so important to all of us.
Very well said. Thank you.
Yeah. Just very, very briefly picking up, I think Matt said it about the big step, and we talked about the big step earlier, which was set up by James Grimes, who was a gambler in recovery. And James has done amazing work. I mean, James, soccer was part of his route into gambling, and it kind of ruined the sport that he loved. James set up the big step, which basically campaigns for getting gambling out of football. And that involves walking between these football stadiums, doing ridiculous distances every day, endurance stuff. It's amazing, and people everywhere wearing yellow shirts, and the amount of media it gets. So that's just kind of a very practical thing. I want to say just a word though about another organisation, which I think we might have almost touched on, which is GamLEARN. Which is an organisation set up by a guy called Tony Parente, another gambler in recovery. And it again chimes with this thing, as you can hear in the name, GamLEARN. It's about understanding what happened to you, what was done to you. Tony's an amazing guy, and he's seen his own SARS. He could see what gambling subjected him to. And literally thousands and thousands and thousands of bets, and that's almost in a day. But Tony, we've worked with for a long time, and he set up an organisation called GamLEARN, which was basically, it's not a Gamblers Anonymous, but GA rather, although Tony did go to that in the past. But GamLEARN had a different emphasis in terms of it was actually offering sessions which were almost educational sessions. And Matt Gaskell, for instance, who's the director of the Northern Problem Gambling Clinic at the NHS service, does the most amazing hour-long session on what gambling does to your brain, what gambling products does to your brain. Next time GamLEARN offer it, if it's available internationally. You couldn't spend an hour better. And it's the sort of thing that makes people realise what happened to them. It challenges their very notion of whose responsibility this was. Now, GamLEARN, working with GamFam, they have regular meetings, they put on regular sessions, etc. But a really impressive thing that they did in terms of engagement was that in response to the gambling white paper consultation, which you keep on hearing bits and pieces about, they put together a submission to that called "We Are the Evidence Too," because so much of this sort of thing is, oh, it's only the big academic studies, it's only those things that count. Actually, there is so much knowledge within the lived experience community that Tony, working with others, and he absolutely say loads of other people are involved in it, put together a survey of their own membership and came up with an incredibly impressive report. It was kind of a 50, 70 page report, and that went in as evidence to the gambling white paper. Now, let's see what influence it had, but it was a very, very impressive document. And it's the sort of thing that, again, people felt that they were contributing their own experience, but not just as their own individual story. It's the learning from that experience and what needed to be changed to regulation. So that's just another example of gamblers in recovery getting together and making an impact on change.
And I know. Can you just elaborate? What tools would Tony do to organize people? Because I think a big part of it is I think there's a desire for people to do something, but what are the ties? How did he get people connected? Is he using like a website? Is he using how does he connect people?
I mean, Twitter was actually. I mean, there's a very big online gamblers in recovery community on Twitter. I mean, it's not particularly a community. There are no particular groupings, but there are literally hundreds, thousands of people who some who tweet occasionally, but some who tweet very regularly. Sorry, Mike.
There's a question asked. What organization are you saying? He's having trouble understanding.
GamLEARN. So it's GamLEARN.
Okay, GamLEARN.
Yeah, so capital G, and the L, I think, is a capital G as well. And so I think Twitter was the starting point of it. I think the other thing is that over the years of campaigning for change, there have been a variety of consultation meetings organised, particularly perhaps by the Gambling Commission, and you'd see the same faces at those meetings, and they were people who had been seriously affected by gambling and wanted to get something done. And so it's kind of almost that snowballing process of identifying and bringing people together. It's a bit like GamFam, which we mentioned before, which it provides supports for families dealing with gambling addiction in the family. And it's a bit of it is word of mouth. And each time there's, and it's similar for Gamblers Live, each time there's media involving them or us, you get the little spike of more people, who you kind of think you've been on the media for years and you've done BBC Breakfast however many times, you kind of think the whole world must know about us. The reality is 0.5% of 0.5% know about it. And I think that's one of the things that we learned very early on. We were given very good advice by a Conservative Party peer who'd worked in PR all his life, and he said that he has to do it with his commercial clients, which is you have to say the same thing again and again and again, and that just goes on forever. And his corporate clients would be saying, sure, we've got to be changing our messaging. And of course, no. That's what you're known for, and you have to get that message through. And it's desperately frustrating for people like us. That's why it's wonderful to be here, where you can talk a bit more broadly, explore ideas. When you're in front of the media, you've got to say your 3 key points, bang, and you say them again, and you kind of think somebody else has Sorry,
Yeah,
Matt.
that's all right. No, just to add to that, so when we campaigned against fixed odds betting terminals, we called them the crack cocaine of gambling, and we repeated it again and again and again. Must have repeated it on TV, on radio, in newspaper comments, 1,000, 2,000 times over the course of 7 years. To the extent that my friends would mock me and say, "Oh, crack cocaine gambling," right? Because they heard me say it so many times. But it became what it was known as. They became known as that, and you just have to find a message that resonates. Test it, maybe test it with polling and focus groups if you want to. We found that the media really caught on to the idea that this particular product was the most addictive form of gambling, therefore it was the crack cocaine of gambling. And that in and of itself reframed the responsible gambling paradigm, because it's then about the product, not the person. So if your messaging can do that, and it's cutting through, then you're onto a winner.
I just wanted to add too, and I said this already, that knocking on the doors, continue to knock. The only way you're going to get people involved is if they hear your story, and if they know that your message hasn't changed in 28 years. I've been saying the same thing over and over and over, and that's how they know that this information is this. I'm not changing my story. I'm not in it for the story. I'm in it to make change, and I think that's what's important, is to continue knocking on the doors and find ways that you can reach the people who need to hear the message. For so many years, we did the same thing, and I was getting the same people at my events over and over, and I said, this is great, and I appreciate the support, but we're not hitting the people who need to hear it. And so you look for other avenues and other ways to do that, and that's where the take a break came from, was hitting, going to the machines and saying, when we shut down a machine for one day, then people have a moment to breathe and to think about what they're doing, and those are the people we can hit. We got more calls and more people who were involved in that issue or that campaign than we did for years. And now we're shifting again a little bit, and we're doing mental health first aid kits. And in the kits are information about gambling, and it's allowing people to have that conversation again, because we're talking about how this has affected them in different ways. And so it's just finding different ways to reach different people in different populations to continue telling that story and to continue this predatory message that we have.
I'm learning so much from the UK, because what I've been saying on it, what the UK is going through now is what the United States is going to go through in a very short time. The question is, how do we get those type of organizations that you're talking about, those advocates, how do we learn from them and bring it to the States on it? How do we make the UK an arm, how do we make the US an arm of the UK organizations on that? Because I'm a firm believer that we can't leave it up to the legislations and regulators. They're the people that created this mess. So the only way to do it is to make awareness to the public. And I think that's what the UK went through for all those years. And now finally enough public is aware of the situation that's forming a change on that. So I need to know more about this.
Kitty.
Kitty, you want to say?
I pay them for their time because their time is of value, and the narrative that people with lived experience want to give back, and that's our gift, falls short of respecting that we've invested years of suffering to gain the knowledge and education and thought to be able to offer the guidance. And so I seek from the funders that support our nonprofit to have a speakers bureau and to keep a list of individuals who are vetted to be able to speak in a way that uses terminology that's not going to promote stigma, and that they're in a place in their recovery not based on actual days abstinence, but a sense of having enough support and stability within their own recovery, that's a safe time for them to be very public. That's usually not within the first year of their recovery, and it's a very serious decision because the internet never forgets. And we need a lot of variety in that list, and I, at this point, would send out an APB to 27-year-old educated men who are going to be targeted by sports operators and then converted over to online casino. Those are going to be the next epidemic of folks that are suffering at a very severe level. And I wonder if that isn't going to be the demographic that finally gets mainstream attention of what's happening with operators creating harm. So if you know those folks, let's make it safe for them to talk about what happened to them.
Just one comment, which is you can't do it on a shoestring. I mean, you've got to pay people. I agree with you. I mean, it's not just paying people with lived experience. You have to pay people who haven't suffered.
Yeah, I mean, that's we're going to talk about that tomorrow.
Yeah.
Part of this is we nationally as an organization have to have the ability now to attract resources, because one of the major differences in a fight here in the U.S. versus the U.K. is they have a national fight there. They have a parliament. The parliament makes policy around gambling. In this country, we have 50 different states. You know, I think 48 of them are some form of predatory gambling that the state pushes. There's all these the geographic differences, the state legislative differences. A lot of people just care about keeping it out of their state. You know, so the funders, no one's really thought about this issue nationally. With the introduction of online sports gambling, that has changed. It's elevated the issue of predatory gambling to a national scope. But that is one of our key priorities. We have to attract resources, bigger resources, to build the kind of team. You know, so in my mind, I know what we need. It's making it happen. But I think we talk about James Grimes. So James Grimes is part of Gambling with Lives. Like what he's doing there, that's an element of this. I would refer to that as direct action. Okay, there's four pillars of successful social movements in world history. All right, and our goal, when I came in this work, I had to relearn politics. I used to be as an operative, and in those days, all you care about was 50% plus one. That's all you do. All you about winning, 50% plus one. All right, politics. In the advocacy world, you got to build a movement. You're awakening people's conscience. And the successful movements that have four key pieces to them. One is litigation, which someone asked about earlier. 2 is legislation. 3 is education. And 4 is direct action. Those 4 pillars. So when I started this work 15 years ago, my goal for these last 15 years is to get action and movement in all 4 of those areas. And they're not always coordinated. It's not like a perfect campaign, like in a political campaign, you control almost everything. From the beginning to the end. This is kind of, you got to take advantage of the opportunities when they come. But the end game is always to create those 4 pillars. So what they're doing with the big step is that's a form of direct action. And it's very powerful. And so anyways, that's our historically us in the gambling issue here in this country. It's about their education. Here's another report. Here's that. We need all that. But we got to. It's about putting the day we can put direct action, shut down a casino, or to do something disruptive. It's not being confrontational. What you're doing is awakening people's conscience. Okay, and I have a whole. This is my life's work. So I have a whole host of ideas what we can do. It's just getting people bought into these concepts, but most of all, attracting the financial resources. That's the big stuff for us is getting to that next level, and we're on the cusp of that. And this conference is helping us get there. But that's why. So you're nailing it. It's definitely about attracting some financial resources as well. Any last comments? Any other questions from the audience? Yes, Carey Theil.
So I just want to pick up on something. You all said it, but Matt, I think, talked about it most explicitly. The narrative, when someone's going through the process of having a problem, and the narrative around that. I'm reminded of the greyhound industry, as we won, as they got more desperate, they exerted more control over the dogs themselves. They started turning adoption groups into political actors. It got so extreme that in the end they said to the adoption groups, you either openly support us as an industry or you'll never again get dogs, and they would in turn then only start adopting the people who would support greyhound racing. So it was this very perverse way of controlling the victims. It's not only mitigating the problem, but actually trying to turn the victims into advocates for the exploitative industry. So I was reminded of that as you were talking about it. I wonder if you and others could just expand on that idea.
Yeah, we've had very similar in Britain with people, so not dogs, people who are funded to do education, research and treatment, one of those three. I don't want to name names obviously, but they had effectively been co-opted by the industry and I presume turned into advocates for the status quo against reform, because otherwise they would stop getting funding. So that's how they control everything. They control the treatment. They want to control the treatment because they don't want people to come out of treatment and think that maybe there was something wrong with the industry. They want to control the research so it doesn't affect policy. And it just talks about problem gambling and doesn't talk about the industry. And they want to control education so people aren't educated on what the industry is doing. They want to control everything. And our job is to get active, is to get people in recovery, at the right stage of recovery, I have to say, not straight after they've lost all the last bit of money, straight into the media or anything. Once they're out of recovery and in a good place, and in that motivated place I spoke about, to undercut all of that. And we've been working very, very hard in the UK to get a statutory levy on the industry that funds research, education and treatment independent of the administration of the industry. At the moment they volunteer where they give that money, and they give it to organisations that they can control, and that can in turn advocate on their behalf. And this levy will make a big, big difference, because it will mean that all of those things are independent and people will know the truth about why they've been harmed by gambling. And that will in turn create more advocates. So it's a big moment, I think, in our long-term objectives.
Perhaps an unwelcome thought. I find that it's necessary to have a seat at the table of tables that I don't enjoy being at, and if those are operator-supported agencies or agencies that pander, so to speak, if I'm there, then I have a voice, and if I'm not, I don't. And so I need to carve out part of my time, my bandwidth, and willingness and grace to participate actively. A lot of times the inroad to being able to have that seat is just doing the admin work and getting an officer role. There's so many of those places where I have to collaborate to be able to just move the needle ever so slightly, and it's stressful. It's hard to what I witnessed, to hear people talk about setting a time and a budget and gift responsibly, and see the list of donors to the research projects. It hurts my soul, and yet I get to see that, and then perhaps by being witness to it, I could ever so slightly make a difference in it.
Well said. Very well said, Kate.
I'll just tell you a little anecdote about how it happens. Quite early on, after Jack died, we were at a conference, and a very, very senior executive from one of the operators approached us and said terribly nicely and charmingly, "Oh, would you come and talk to my safer gambling team?" Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you remember, do you remember? But I said to him, "Yes, of course we will, but I need to tell you that we will talk about abuse." Mm-hmm. And he just turned around and walked off. Mm-hmm. And that's how it happens. Mm-hmm. Let me be terribly nice to you. Oh, I'll care for you. It's such a tragedy. The word tragedy, as though it wasn't murder.
Just a very final word on that as well is the need to consider evidence which isn't just lived experience evidence. It is important to relate to all of the academic evidence, the studies which go on. Just because somebody's got lived experience doesn't mean they are right. And I think that, going back to GamLEARN again, that is part of that process, is allowing people who have got that lived experience to reflect on that lived experience and think, what does this mean? What are the real solutions? And I think, as Matt says, it's very easy to buy lived experience. It's very cheap for the gambling industry to buy lived experience, to get somebody who will pop up saying what is ever a comfortable message for them. And that's why it isn't just enough to say, I'm a recovering gambler, I now know the world. You know, that it is duty bound on all of us to actually reflect and understand our experience and the experience of others.
And that is about recovery agency and enabling people to recover agency. That process of making us human again, that we can reflect on our experience and learn from it.
I just wanted to say too, along those lines, I met with our governor shortly after my brother had passed, and he was the same. He said, well, I'm sorry that happened. You know, it does happen to a small number of people. Can't use this as entertainment. They do become addicted, and you know, that's just part of this business and part of it. And I'm sorry that happened to him, but it's just a small number. And he said, you know, it's a sacrifice. And I said, I wasn't willing to make that sacrifice though. I said, if you were to go home and look at your family, who would you like to sacrifice? You're saying that's a small number, it's just a few. So you have a big family, go home and look and tell me who you would like to sacrifice, because I didn't have a choice in what you're calling my sacrifice. So you go home and tell me. And he said, well, that's just not fair. That's not a fair statement. That's not a fair comparison. And I said, absolutely it is. This is something you brought in. This is something that you designed, you know, with our Oregon Lottery Commission, and this is the setup of it. And I wasn't willing to make a sacrifice that you just told me was kind of my duty, as someone who was, my brother was weak, or he was, you know, had other issues or other problems. And I said, but gambling is what took him down. But gambling is a thing that he wasn't. He was a successful person. He was, you know, a person of our community that did good things. He was a hard worker. He did all the things that he was taught to do. He was, you know, an upstanding citizen. And this is what brought him down. And they weren't willing to see it that way. But I think that's, like you just said, it's just something that the way it's talked about and the way, you know, I'm not willing to be in that percentage that, you know, well, it's just got to be a few, is not acceptable. It's not acceptable.
The only last thing I say about Kitty's comments or so is you need all kinds of folks. There's different lanes in the reform world. So you need some folks, there's thousands of people who are in the existing infrastructure today across this country who are part of the so-called responsible gambling world, who really don't like what's going on. But you have to awaken people's conscience. You got to, you know, one by one. So you go in and you keep, be honest with people, speaking the truth respectfully, and you just keep being aggressive relentlessly. But I think how people handle it, you got to keep it. It is part of the political process too. You have to awaken people's conscience in this. And some people don't get it right away. So you have to have all those conversations, and you never know it. Sometimes you meet people who are like the staunchest opponent from you, and then a year later you run into them. Hey, you know, I get it now. You know what I mean? But you just have. It takes a while. Some people don't get it. Some people do. But you have to keep going in. You have to straddle those worlds and you keep, you know, pushing the envelope from all directions, and that's how change happens. So, anyway, I thought that was a heck of a panel. I mean, I think you guys was an amazing discussion. Glad we got to